With every big commitment comes the great sacrifice. Greater the commitment, bigger the sacrifice.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the part 3 of the BMS instrumental production. In this part I will be talking about mixing process itself. My name is Zog Sabjan, aka ZTime, and I will be your host today, but I will still thank Vlad for his inspiring thoughts. Yes, the commitment is one of the things in mixing that requires a lot of sacrifices in many ways. Let me explain really what has happened. I run a hybrid type of mixing environment. I use hardware and I use software and I join them together into the hybrid system. So compromise is what I have decided to make a few years ago. When I built this studio, I went with the idea of the old times, what I remembered, what I learned in studios. I remember going to the studios and seeing all the gear, you know, these great producers, and every gear had this kind of marks on it and labels and pieces of papers, and you know, every button was kind of maybe even taped sometimes, you know, like stay in a position, you know, don't move them. I wondered and asked, and of course I learned from my own experiences that all the gear that you have, they do have their own sweet spots, and quite a lot of producers, they settle for those sweet spots, and in those sweet spots, you know, they work with those pieces of hardware. So my idea was to create outboard stems of hardware that I could actually run and mix through. And I asked myself about the recalls, and because of all the vast, you know, number of possibilities that you can have, I came up with a system that I will work and try to find those sweet spots. And when I find, and I'll try to keep those hardware equipment stems in the same pretty much ballpark what they are, and only fine tune them now and then when it's important and how it's important. And then I'll just write those notes of those changes into my mixing sessions. So my hardware system consists of 6 different stems, and they go as drums, then the bass, the vocal, then I have a keys, then I have a strings 1 and strings 2. Those are the hardware pieces that I choose, and sometimes also change, and I mix into them. And then as well, in my hybrid mixing system, I also have a mix bus where I run a couple of analog compressors and an analog EQ. And then I sum all of those parts, so all of those analog stems plus some groups that I send directly from the DAW, I sum via the solid state logic summing mixer called Sigma. I like SSL Sigma because I can automate as well if I need to through my DAW. If we now go to the DAW, I will show you that I send all my different elements to buses. There is a drum bus, there is a string bus 1, there is a keys bus, and there is a string bus 2, and there is also a stereo bass bus here. So these all go through the hardware EQs and compressors and processings. And then I as well have a couple of more buses in this song. The percussion bus goes directly to Sigma summing mixer, as well as Inceptor, which is my brass. It also goes directly to Sigma summing mixer. So let's get into groove again and fix the headphones and hope they work. Put the headphones up and let's see how this works. I usually start mixing with the drums and the main parts. So if whichever elements are the main ones, I start mixing with those ones. And of course, in this song, the drums are quite important. So let's see from the beginning, for instance, what kind of processing I use on the drums. I am showing here the original Uncivilized Grooves drum stems that have been used through the song. I'm soloing them and I'm playing a part, verse 1B, when there is a bit more happening. And let's play this a little bit and listen to just the drums. Okay, all the insert plugins that have been used are put directly on the drum bus. And then when I'm done with making all the adjustments and the things that I like, I always print in a later stage of mixing, record the drum bus to the drum bus R you see recorded. I recorded it there and I just then mute the inserts and recoup the resources for other elements in mix. So let's listen to both of the drum sections, the MPC drums and the Uncivilized Grooves drum stems playing in solo. And as you can hear, there are also percussions. The percussions will then go to their own percussion bus, and the drums all go to the drum bus. After the plugin inserts, the processing inserts, the signal from the drum bus goes through the hardware chain. I'm mixing into the hardware chain, hitting the sweet spots and mixing there via the plugins and different choices that I make. So it's like a color on top of another color. So I create the color in the box and all the processing that I want, I create it in a software and I send it and spice it up still with my hardware. So I basically mix into the hardware to achieve this kind of hybrid sound as well. Let's see what the processing has been there on those drums. First, there is the SPL Iron. I love it. I have it as a hardware and I use it on my mix master insert. And I use here the plugin version for the drums. Standard settings, what I usually like. One remark. I work on the 96 kilohertz 64-bit. I found that 96 kilohertz sounds better, the processing, the VSTI, so the soft synths, and the plugin processing sounds better in 96K. And because I run in a Cubase, I run also in a 64-bit float. And the reason why I run in a 64-bit float is that I personally, from my tests, found it to be superior than any 32-bit. Certain plugins are written also on a 64-bit float, but some plugins aren't. And those plugins that aren't written in a 64-bit float, I follow with a simple but amazing plugin which is called Purest Fade, which is just a gain plugin, but it's done by Air Windows. And I use this because this one makes a perfect dithering calculation of the 30-bit back to 64. So my next plugin, whichever comes after that, is happily working again in a 64-bit float. SPL Iron is a 32-bit plugin. I follow it with a Purest Fade, which perfectly then dithers the 32 and changes it to the 64-bit. And the credit goes to my brother mastering engineer, who has made a test that this one sounded best than the others. I trusted him and made my own tests and it did sound very good. So I follow always every 32-bit plugin with a 64-bit float calculation with the purest fade from the air windows. Okay, so let's listen what exactly the SPL Iron does to these drums. So this is without. And apart from the loudness that I have achieved, I also have achieved quite a nice glue and a very, very beautiful sound. I love the TMT mode in the plugin. I use it a lot. I find the channels that I like. In this case, I used 1 and 2. I use it in MNS mode, which means mid and side. Increase headroom so that I get cleaner sound, and use the high pass filter a little bit. No mono making, and a little bit of stereo width. I personally think that the stereo width is the best in about 110 to 115, but in this case it worked really well around 125. And parallel mix this time I didn't use any, so this is a full plugin in its full work. Silicon 330 mode, and attack the slowest and release almost the fastest. The tube biases are on the mid. This is from my experiences with the hardware. I try to keep the things that I know that work, and for this it worked very well. And the sidechain EQ, I use the EQ2 mode. And to that I'm adding another plugin, and that plugin is a Pink from Acoustica Audio. It's a graphic EQ that I think sounds great on the drums. Lifting the tops, the highs, and a little bit of 2K, and a little bit of 63 Hz there, and a little bit of AK, and midget off of the 500. So let's listen with and without the Pink. And as you can hear, there is quite a nice brightness and a punch that this EQ brings. The next processing I use is the SplitEQ, and SplitEQ is my new addition to my arsenal in the box, and it's by Eventide, and I absolutely love this plugin. This has been true revelation for me. I love this EQ. It's intuitive and super easy to use. I generally boosted a little bit of lows, but I boost a little bit of transient more than I boost the tonal. Tonal is a blue, the transient is green. So I use the same curve, but I boost more the transient, so the transients in low will come up, but the fluff stays controlled. And I move the same in the midsection and use the certain curves, and in the top section, because of the sparkling hi-hats and things, I go the opposite. I basically use tonal more, and I even drop down the transient a little bit, so to keep it a little bit more smooth, so that I don't have to overcompress and use all sorts of different things for taming those hi-hats. And the same for the top, I lift the tonal qualities and keep the transients pretty intact. Drums are very important, and I work quite a bit on them. And without. And with. Off. And on. So the punch, it just kind of feels that it gels together and it's punching. I love it. It's great. It's great. And of course I follow that one with the purest fade as well for the 64-bit float. And after that I use the Chandler limiter curve bender. I usually use it as a parallel processing, but this time I use it on the bus in, again, mid and side processing, and the standard EQ curves that I found that works for me very well. And let's listen without it. and width. I love the sound that it gives with. It gives me this old, you know, it almost feels like a little bit old-fashioned sounding processing that a little bit, you know, gives the grit and things. I love it. It's absolutely great. And after that, I follow it with a heater. Heater is an amazing noise ash audio plugin, and it has a saturation, and there is, as you can see, in parallel. And I increase the bass and treble, and I use certain processings, what I found that works good for this beat and this song. Let's listen without it. And with. And again, when all the things are connected, when every processing is made, this makes a lot of sense. It just tames it and makes it a little bit more sounding analog. And the last processing on a drum bus I use is NEOLD BIG, again from Plugin Alliance, and I use it in a starving mode, which is called voltage sag, and I use a very little bit of saturation from it because I have a heater in front of it. I use again to add me a different type of broad highs and a little bit of lows. And again, I use it in parallel, maybe 40%. And let's listen now without it first. And with. And again, because of the gain staging, it feels that it's louder before, but that's normal. I usually drop them down so that it doesn't go into any distortion inside within the plugin. So this is my whole chain in the DAW, and this is how it basically sounds without all of the plugins. And you are listening it going through the hardware. So you are listening the whole hardware chain now. So the hardware processing is included in what you're listening already, and the additional plugins are just coloring again before it hits the hardware. And again, without. Drums done. When they are done, I have a little internal recording bus always set up that I just send the stuff and I record directly, then I mute them and I run it as a recorded drum bus to preserve the resources. And one extra thing that I want to point out is I use an additional bass drum, as you can see here, as a doubler, that I add a double bass drum in the mix that I run separately with its own little reverb sense. And I use still Eventide's SplitEQ to slightly emphasize its qualities. So I run additional double bass drum in the final mix to get even more kick from the lower end. In order to send the full process signal to the reverb units and any additional effect processing, I run the system where I return everything from hardware back to the recording channels, normal audio recording channels, and I call them a dummy channels. So you can see it here, it's called Drum Bus Dummy In, and what it does, it's a really cool thing. Sigma has a direct out, so whatever comes to certain Sigma channels in, it can go directly out, and that direct outs are then connected back to the DAW, and they are not routed anywhere. You see, there is no output, no bus for the output. There is the input, they come in, And all what they do is they are triggering my effects. So it's really cool because I have all the automation and everything that I need to trigger my effects processings. And as you can see here, I send into 3 different effects, and let's see what happens with those ones. So Cinematic Rooms by Liquid Sonics. That was the first send that you have seen. The second send is the AMS from UAD. And the third one, it's again from the Liquid Sonics. It's the HD cartridge. The HD cartridge is a Lexicon 480 emulation from Liquid Sonics' secondary company, which is called Reverb Foundry. The same owner, the Liquid Sonics and Reverb Foundry. I use 3 reverbs to adjust and get a different kind of space that I create for the drums. I always work very much on the room, on the space where I'm sending it, because I think it's crucial that I have a nice, good place. And in this case, on a drum bus, I'm using 3 different rooms. Every single room in a DAW, I give them exactly the same treatment as what they would have if they would go through my hardware boxes. So every hardware box has some kind of preamp or some kind of circuitry that comes in, and of course it has the A to D conversions. And then, because it's the analog box, there is some kind of electronics and things happening, and there is some kind of saturation happening. In my logic, to recreate in a box the good sounding reverb unit, I use it as such. 3 components of the reverb are preamp, reverb itself with processing, whatever it is, and the saturation at the end of it. So when we now look here that we have 3 different reverbs, and let's see what happens in a Cinematic Rooms drums reverb send. I start with UAD Helios Type 69 mic pre. Sometimes I EQ a little bit, sometimes I don't. But I run it in the line on microphone mode, whichever I found that saturates nice towards the reverb that I'm sending to. In this case, I have a preamp set in the microphone mode, and I'm using also some EQ, what I find pleasing for the sound, and adjust the output, or actually the input, towards the reverb itself accordingly. And after that I have Cinematic Rooms. I use medium room, and I follow it by again another UAD plugin, which is the AMS Neve DFC channel strip, and here I just increase the width for the reverb to make it a little bit wider, as well as sometimes some compressor or EQ additionally at the end of the chain. And then when we talk about the AMS channel, AMS goes first again through the Helios. I love that. And then it goes to of course to the AMS, and it ends with the DFC as well. And there is the width, pretty much similar type of thing. In the AMS, I use the ambience and the K is 1.6 with a little pre-delay. And lastly, the third part of my space for the drums, I use Avalon Mic Pre 737 SP as the preamp, again from the UAD, and the medium room on a HD card, and following with another gem from the UAD, which is Empirical Labs Fatso SR. I use it as a saturation and a little bit of EQing of that room space as well. So every single part of those 3 reverb chains or sends is identical like in a hardware. An input gain on mic preamp, reverb itself, and some kind of width and saturation for the, you know, little spicing up of those reverbs. And let's hear how it sounds. First without, sends are muted. And with. And this concludes the drum section mixing. Of course, I have now been showing in isolation, but I go there with all the elements still playing and readjust all of those elements and tweak and everything. But you get the basic idea of the workflow and which ways I have designed my hybrid system. So you have the whole bus of drums processed, coming through the hybrid system, coming back to the DAW to trigger the reverbs, and those reverbs returns are then basically sent to the Sigma summing mixer, which are joined with a dry signal that is originally already there, and it creates the drum sound. When you look to my Sigma thing, you can see here that I have drums, and those drums are coming into my channel inputs 3 stereo, and they're going to the mix bus B, and mix bus B is where I have my drum hardware, compressor and EQ, and they are joined then with everything else in a master. So there is like a mix B goes to A, and this is the level of the mix B. So I always have my drums separately in a level, and mix A is everything else. So I can always fine tune how loud my drums are in the whole overall mix. So then they are all summing together into the output, which is then processed with the hardware, a couple of compressors and EQ, and recorded as a mix master. Let me try to clarify a little bit better the hybrid system and its connections. We start from in the box from the source material tracks. Then we route those tracks to the buses, and we process individual tracks with certain processing, and then we process the group tracks with different plugins and processings. Then we send those group buses physically out from the DAW via audio interfaces, and the physical output is connected from the audio interfaces out, digital to analog conversion, into the analog chain. I call it analog stems, and each stem processes its signal and sends its final result to SSL Sigma summing mixer. The summing mixer sums all the parts, and here we can see it on the screen. The summing mixer sums all the buses that has been sent through the DAW out to the hardware processing and to Sigma. It sums the bass, the vocal, the drums, the strings, keys, strings 2, FX1 sum, FX2 sum, and here at the bottom we still have a brass and percussion in this example. So Sigma is summing all of that stuff together, and then individually there are two buses, the mix A and mix B. And on the mix B I insert my percussion or drums section additional processing, which is another compressor and EQ, and then all together is summed again and sent out to the main output of the Sigma, and that goes to the outboard, two compressors and the EQ. And the final output from the last processing compressor on the mix bus is then recorded into another computer as the final mix master. So I make some kind of decisions inside of the box in the DAW, what do I group and which groups they go. And also for that reason I have assigned two effects buses in my DAW, just to give them a separation also and possibility to later on mix them together in Sigma summing mixer. The big part of this system is also sending back the individual outputs what actually come into the Sigma. So those groups that come to my summing mixer are also sent out and back physically to the DAW's inputs, where they are used as dummies. I call them as a dummies because they don't go back to any mixing or any other. They are just triggering the effects sense and give me the possibility to automate, mute, or whatever I need to with the effects sense. So it's basically like a recorded material on audio track that has been sent nowhere for mixing purpose apart from to the effect sense and triggers the effect sense. And then that effect return is summed together in a hardware summing mixer with the original analog source. So there I get best possible quality of the direct analog signal and triggered effects summing together again in the analog domain. It sounds a little bit complex, but in reality, once you get used to it, it's super simple. For me, the sound benefits are so much more worth the inconveniences I have to go to run a little hybrid system like that. Okay, let's go back to Groove and see what else is there. Let's go and check the bass. In this BMAS song instrumental, I run bass as a stereo bass, and it goes to the bass stereo bus. Let's solo the bass and let's see what goes in it. And here we see the channel. Slapper Bass uses one additional plugin, TrackSpacer. In the TrackSpacer, I use only a certain frequency to duck the bass. So the bass is going to be ducked, compressed a little bit more in the places where the bass drum kicks, only from the frequency of 36 to 200. Everything else will stay intact. And as you can see, very little amount. Ratio is 8.5%. So let's listen now again the bass as it is triggered by the bass drum itself. And there you go. So the TrackSpacer basically ducks that bass really nicely in the places where I want it to. The bass is processed itself with Bettermaker EQ. I run it as a typical Baltic, a little bit of boost and a little attenuation, and then I'm adding still the couple of EQs to get a little bit of character going on. You know, it's to taste. I try to get out from the instruments what is really good. I try to preserve what is great in the instrument itself and the attacks and the flavors, and try to match them or take away certain things when needed for it to better fit with other instruments in the mix. The next one is Neve compressor, Lindell 254E. A lovely compressor, nothing fancy, pretty much always stays in a ratio 3:1. and then the rest to taste and depending on the rhythm of the song. And the last, I also on the bass use the Eventide's SplitEQ, which in this case again gives splitting in between transient and tonal qualities of the tone. And as you can see, again, I lift transient a little bit in the low end and lower the tonal so that I get punch and biting. And the same for a mid. I increase the transient, but I keep sometimes tonal down or at the same level, depends in which way I can get the best qualities of the bass, how I want very broad strokes on the SplitEQ. And that's all processing inside the box that I use for the bass. The next in line are strings. In a string bus 1, I have the instrument like Iceni and bass. And in a string bus 1, I'm using additional processing on Iceni basses. And those processings are to slightly push and shape the Iceni basses so that they fit with the whole low string orchestra bus. As you can see, a little shape on a Massenburg Designworks MDW EQ5 UAD EQ, which sounds about like this. So again, the processing for the string bus 1 is as follows. I use an UAD Manley. I like the Manley for its woolly, wooden kind of EQ'd feeling. But here in this, I decided to do quite a few cuts and just one little boost on the top frequency. And its flavor, it's very, very beautiful for the strings. I use it a lot. So the Manley EQ, MassivePasive, followed by another favorite of mine, which is Plugin Alliance Tube Equalizer TE100 made by Lindell Plugins. It's no, I probably in every forum recommend this so much. I love it. I try to always keep the oversampling as high as I can with my processing power that is available in the DAW, and if used in mastering I go full 16 times. Oversampling is great, and I keep analog on as well. And then again, it's all about the taste and what frequency I want to lift or cut away and emphasize. After those two EQs, I go to another very nice plugin. It's again Plugin Alliance, is the Shadow Hills Industries. This is the mastering compressor that I use, and I use both optical and discrete compressors. Almost nothing. Touch little glue and peaking when the song develops. Here probably. So it gives me this extra little push that I absolutely love. This is the little touches, but those touches go a long way when you send them to the analog hardware, and then the little, different breaking points, saturations and things happen as you have sent it out. So after those, I still run one little plugin which adds a little bit of ambience, and that is Fiedler Audio Stage. Great to enhance the ambience, panorama, make some little effects and different kind of things. I use kind of like a master stereo enhancer preset. It's very nice to start with some good presets. Those guys have spent hours designing those nice presets. I very often go through the presets, sometimes just to learn what is possible from the plugin, but sometimes also as a starting point, and then just adjust it a little bit accordingly as it fits to that exact purpose what I'm using it. So great way to start with the presets. Don't be afraid of them. You don't have to invent the hot water all the time. Keep the mixing flow going and get your starting points from presets. It's very okay to do. And that's all there is on the String Bus 1. So the next online is my drone and the dark voices going to my keyboards bus. And in my keys bus, I use first the Water 2 EQ from Acoustica Audio. I like to use enhancements for the sounds what there are in the frequencies. This is a very mellow, very beautiful sounding EQ in many ways, also quite precise. And I increase highs around 6K upwards, cut a little bit low end down, and increase the mid around 2K a touch. The AMS Neve, a little EQ and compressor on the Neve DFC channel strip, UAD. Just a little gain reduction. As you can see, little gain reduction. And the most prominent processing role in the keys bus has definitely the DMG Audio Limitless plugin. I seldom use limiters on the buses, but on the keys I find them to put a keyboard sounds always in the designated place in the mix where I want, and I use it also as a creative tool for the EQing because this limiter is absolutely stunning. It has so many nice little options, and I carve my little curve by adjusting the way how the limiter reacts to each frequencies. And I here use a little bit of clipping for additional color. And that's all about the keyboard bus. The next what follows is a String Bus 2. And a String Bus 2 consists of a couple of instruments, and this is basically Suspiro strings and the Albion strings. We could actually listen to them here at the end when they are both happening. And let's just listen once without the processing. Okay, so as you can see, I brighten it up quite a bit and try to again get the best qualities out of those sounds. Specifically when you're listening to those Suspiro strings happening in this section here. I want them to be easy and airy, so the most decision was there to put those two together is that actually fitted, because I also wanted to lift and process the high strings in the same similar kind of way, but one would be in the background and the other one would be more prominent higher. So on this channel the processing is again quite simple. First I use again the Fiedler audio stage for getting the spread and the ambience a little bit more in size. I use quite a lot of spread there to keep them also a little bit in the background, but to also give the width of the mix. Then I use, again, probably most favorite EQ at the moment, the Eventide SplitEQ. And you see broad strokes, but I a little bit cutting away, dipping away in the mid where I found that it was quite muddy. So I was just taking a little bit of mud away and then enhancing the higher slopes. As you can see, the tonal is a little bit higher and more prominent the blue line is the tonal, you see. Then the transient on the top, because again the bite can be sometimes a little bit too harsh, and that's why this EQ is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. You can tame the harshness by lowering the transients, and you can increase the tonal portion of the signal, which gives you the kind of a body and the quality of the sound, and it doesn't stick out, so you don't have to compress it too much or, you know, process it in the other ways. Great invention. Great. Thank you, Eventide. After the Eventide, I use another EQ, which is the Bettermaker EQ232D. Which is another great remake of the mastering EQ. I use it again in the mid and side, and I do a little bit of width, but I also a little bit differently process the mid signal and the top and the side signal and the top. This is just up to the taste, and then of course in the mid range I use a different things to spread a little bit those frequencies that are cluttering the center, spread them more towards the sides so that I get a little bit of space in the mid for the other instruments that I want there to be in a focus. And then I finished the Bettermaker EQ with NEOLD BIG, which is another Plugin Alliance plugin, and again I have my so-called voltage sag on, I call it starving, and I increase a little bit of highs but I keep the lows as they were, and just a little bit of saturation there, and the mix is on total full, so it's the full processing of the plugin that is implemented in this. So creating a lot of space, carving out the mids and giving the high sparkle to the mix in the string too. And what is left still is percussion. Percussion you have heard already in the context of the drums, but I was just not soloing it. It's simple. That kind of instruments are in a percussion bus, and again I use, to get some width, this time I use Air Windows Wider. It's a very simple plugin. I just a little bit increase the width, and I use again the UAD MWW EQ5, which is a Massenburg Designworks EQ. I make this kind of shape. Again, I'm carving that low mud, and I'm increasing a lot of top, and I'm increasing quite a lot around 1.4 kilohertz as well. And I'm finishing it off again with Limitless limiter from DMG Audio, and again I'm using its limiting capabilities to limit by the frequency. It's like an additional little EQ. I limit a little bit more the lower end and let the top be, so when it bumps in it a little bit limits more there, and I use a little bit of clipper as a sound effect. That's all there is in the percussion bus. And what is still worth mentioning is that a couple of instruments don't go to any buses, they go directly to the hardware's out and to the Sigma summing mixer. And first of them is the Viola Pizz. And I do this because I process the viola as a main instrument. I process it individually, but this is very simple processing that I do. All I do is use my Helios mic pre EQ and a little bit EQ, touch EQ, and just to use the line mic pre to give me a little bit more umph and spice. I'm a great believer that the mixing process starts as soon as you start arranging and composing. You're choosing the type of the instruments and their qualities for the reasons already within the composition and orchestration moment. So when I used this Viola Pizz, which was Amati viola from Native Instruments library, and I adjusted all mic positions and the qualities that I wanted there already. So I just wanted to bring a little bit more there up with the tiny EQ adjustment and the analog chain processing. And the second one that is also sent directly is that interceptor low brass, and I process it again individually here, and I go out directly. I'm running Chandler limiter curve bender EQ, and this time in a normal stereo mode, and then again the Chandler limited Zener limiter, which both together work into designating a specific nice space for that effect to happen. And without processing. So the obvious difference. And that's absolutely everything there is. Still, I want to point out a usage of the reverbs in this song. As we have already seen, that I've used 3 cents for the drums itself, and I explained how they worked. I used on my string 1 a very interesting reverb that I love to bits. It's called the Capital Chambers from UAD. And this is the settings that I came up with. It's again exactly the same principle. What I like to do is I first run, before the reverb, I run some kind of mic pre or preamplifier and a little bit of EQ if needed. And this time I use the Neve from UAD. It's a 1084. And then it goes to the Capital Chambers. And after that, it goes to the UAD Empirical Labs Fatso SR for additional saturation and perhaps little kind of EQing or compression. And this sounds like this. And without a reverb. It just gives that extra little place in coherent space around the instrument that I like very much. And on the string 2 bus, I used Lustrous plates from Liquid Sonics. Really lovely one. I made kind of like a huge vocal plate. With this one, I didn't use any preamp because I liked it already how it was. I used the EQ afterwards, and it kind of also sounded very nice and very interesting. And for that I used the UAD Neve 1084. So together they're sounding like this. And without. With. Just giving that little bit of extra space and shimmer and just putting them a touch little bit more behind than what they were, nothing extreme. The reverb that I used for the percussion, I used the AMS, the same ambience that was the part of the 3 reverbs that I created for the drum bus. And the send to that ambience was quite fairly bit more, you see 10.9, that it was on the whole drum bus, which was in that particular part of the 3 reverb design was only at -17. And like they say, sugar comes at the end. I don't want to use my German for that. The usage of hardware effects is still very big in my productions. In this production, it was only the stereo bass that got the treatment, but it got the treatment for a specific room that I love to use. It is actually Yamaha SPX 2000 hardware. It's a digital AES connection from the DAW running on 96 kilohertz, because Yamaha SPX 2000 can run the digital AES at the 96 kilohertz. And this is the sound what I get. And without. So it gives a nice little space and a spark on the sides, which I really liked. I use this wooden room a lot from the Yamaha SPX 2000 on the bass. And that concludes my hybrid workflow in mixing, with the remark that no matter how much time you have, you never have enough to make a, even better mix. The point is that compromises need to be made, and the most critical thing is to understand when to commit, when something is there, and move on. There will always be sacrifices, and those sacrifices are the part of the workflow as well. Big sacrifice is hybrid mixing, because certain things you have to take care of, and you might have problems. There are patch bays, there are cables, there are all sorts of different things. You need to take care of those, and you need to allocate a little bit of extra time for those in mixing process as well. Maybe it's not that easy to move from one song to another, but I have not had the problems, and I think that the sound that impacts to my productions, the hardware processing and the summing mixer, is well worth it, and the workflow sacrifices are just a trade-off that I'm super happy to accept. And the final thought is, in my tests, I came up with the conclusion that it's really worth capturing at 384 kilohertz, and I decided to do so. So everything that analog comes out from my last compressor on the mix bus insert, it goes to the PC in its own dedicated audio interface, and in that PC I capture my final master. I might do the mastering in 192 kilohertz or 384 kilohertz. It doesn't matter, but I always capture to the best possible quality that I can, and this is at the moment for me 384 kilohertz 64-bit float. Thank you very much for watching, and thanks for your time. Please do consider to support us and join us on Patreon. You will find the details in the link below. As well, if you find this kind of tutorials interesting, do subscribe and be notified when the new ones are released. I thank you so much for your time, and let's funk it up and stay inspired, guys.